Welcome into episode 197 of the Skate Podcast. I'm Brian DeFelice, joined by Bridgette and Scott McLaughlin. Well, we found out some further news regarding the Boston Bruins and one of their key players, and that's Hampus Lindholm. So I don't know if one of you guys want to mention where the story came from, because after media breakup day, mums was the word, hush hush was the word, but somebody went back to their native country and let the cat out of the bag, and now we know a little bit more about Hampus Lindholm.
Yeah, so just so people know, we'd recorded the rest of this episode before this news broke, but we did want to touch on it and drop this in because obviously pretty important news that broke on Wednesday. And it's weird, this. So he said this to a Swedish newspaper. It was actually last week, and because it was in Swedish, apparently no one picked it up. It just didn't spread across the Atlantic Ocean to the U.S. But Lindholm told the Swedish newspaper that he had to decline an invitation to play for Sweden in the World Championships because he found out that he had a fracture in his foot. Brian, as you mentioned, we knew Lindholm was dealing with a lower body injury. Montgomery had said that. Lindholm had said that. He blocked a shot against Detroit on March 11th and then missed the next game the next day. And then he sat one more game a couple weeks after that. And Montgomery said he was just dealing with a nagging lower body injury. Lindholm on breakup day was asked about it, and he said he was fine. He said everyone's dealing with stuff. It is what it is type thing. So my understanding here is that when Lindholm told the Swedish newspaper that he found out that day that it was a fracture, I think he's telling the truth. I don't think they knew that he had a fracture in the regular season or during the playoffs. I just don't, whatever x-rays, MRIs that they did, I think it just didn't show up, which can happen, especially if it's a hairline fracture. They don't always show up. Sometimes it takes further testing, or maybe it gets worse or whatever. So I actually do believe them that they probably didn't know this in the regular season or during the playoffs. But they wound up finding it sometime after the year.
Yeah, and it was pretty clear, and we had talked about it and didn't really have an answer for how his play had changed. From, if you think back to the beginning of the season when Charlie McAvoy was still recovering from surgery, it was Hampus Lindholm that was leading the defense, and he looked like an elite defenseman in that stretch of time when he was really their top guy back there. And we were even having a conversation. I remember saying this months ago. Could Hampus Lindholm be an X factor in the playoffs for the Bruins, even more so than Charlie McAvoy? And then that Hampus Lindholm kind of went away. And it makes more sense that he didn't just hit a slump and that there was a physical situation going on with him that made his play less comfortable. So therefore his transition game slowed down. Even the last episode that we put up yesterday, we were talking about what were some of the biggest individual mistakes of the 2023 playoffs for the Bruins. And Brian, yours was Hampus Lindholm clearing the puck over the glass. And there was another time in Game 7 that Lindholm had a failed clear that led to a goal. And so we're pointing to some of his mistakes in the playoffs, and we did not know that at the time he was dealing with this foot injury.
Well, and I think the biggest sentiment for people when this news kind of came out was, well, that makes sense. Because I remember during the actual playoff series, we were breaking down one of the games, and I remember just watching him and saying on the podcast, he just looked like Bambi. He was making, and that he was just falling with no pressure on him. And it made no sense to me because skating is probably his greatest asset and best attribute. He's such a powerful skater. And so for him to just be, slipping on ice with nobody around him and just looking hesitant, going in after puck retrievals, it was either this guy just is crumbling under pressure and he's a choke artist, or there's something going on. And it turns out that it was the latter. But like, I just don't, what pisses me off, and I think rightfully so, and probably a lot of fans, is if you're the Florida Panthers and if you're Hampus Lindholm and you're on the Florida Panthers this year and you're scratching and clawing for a playoff spot up until the game 82, that's one thing. But he was on the Boston Bruins, and this Boston Bruins team had a playoff spot all year. But they had a playoff spot locked up for at least the final month of the season, technically, or maybe even longer, right? And so even if the Bruins didn't know, even if Hampus Lindholm didn't know technically it was a broken foot or a fractured foot, like, why are you playing? Rest it. Your team is in the playoffs. Your team has locked up the President's Trophy. They locked up the President's Trophy, back in early March, late February? What's the team doing in that situation? That's what annoys me the most.
Yeah, which I think is understandable. Like, I think it's certainly fair to question, if the injury really was affecting him that much, like, yeah, why? At least the last couple games, maybe, like, I know they wanted to play everyone those last 2 games to ramp up for the playoffs, but Krejci rested because he was clearly dealing with something. So yeah, Lindholm could have. I just, I wonder, like, if in Lindholm's mind, is it something where it's like, hey, it's good enough to walk on. It's good enough. The foot fits in my skate. I can go out there and skate like I'm playing. They haven't found anything that would indicate like I should be sitting. So, that's one where it's like, obviously if the medical staff had found it, then they can make recommendations based on a fracture and say like, okay, you should rest this amount of time. You should rest as much as possible or whatever. But when you don't know that and you think maybe it's just sore, maybe it's whatever, you think it's, I don't know, a bruise that's lasted a while, like whatever it might be, you go to like the medical staff isn't going to be like, yeah, he should definitely sit. Like they're probably thinking it's just a little sore, but it fits on the skate and he can skate. So like, what's the issue? It's not getting any worse. So it's tough. Obviously, you would like to have caught that earlier, and because I'm sure that would change how they would have approached it. But to Bridget, like the points you're making about it affecting his play, I think to me, like it doesn't excuse like the puck over the glass or the turnover up the boards. Those are just poor decisions. I don't think those really have anything to do with the broken foot, but it certainly does help explain, like you said, like not being as noticeable in transition, not getting going with his skating game, not being as involved in the offensive zone and cycling and all that. Like that, those are all the areas where his skating ability has always shown up. And now you hear this and it's like, yeah, okay. Like now that makes sense that his skating wasn't as good as we had seen earlier in the season. So, I think like you can look at like the 0 points in 7 games. You're like, all right, this probably helps explain some of that. Still doesn't totally excuse his performance. And, again, obviously like it wasn't serious enough that because like, if you think like broken foot, like fully broken, serious fracture, like that foot's not going in a hockey skate. So obviously it wasn't that serious if it's not even showing up on whatever testing they did. But if you're dealing with any sort of foot ailment, like, yeah, it's probably going to affect your skating.
And well, but like if it was not feeling better in a month, you said that happened against Detroit in, was it early March?
Yeah, March 11th.
If it's not feeling better in a month, then I think it's not just bruised. And that my guess is it got worse and worse. So like I think maybe he was dealing with the worst of it in the playoffs because he wasn't resting it. So not only did it not have a chance to heal, anything that hit it or just skating on it in general could have been making it just making it worse. And then obviously having to go get it looked at in Sweden, it was maybe about a month and a half, 2 months after it happened. So obviously he was probably getting worried, like, okay, well, this just it doesn't feel right still. So at some point, I'm guessing he or medical noticed that, If it were just, a bad bruise or what have you, it wouldn't still be painful a month plus later. And it probably doesn't excuse the puck over the glass and the turnovers, but I feel like sometimes when you're playing injured, your mental game suffers because you're trying to fight through pain, and you might not have that quick response time to certain things because your brain is focusing on two different things at the same time, which is what should I do with this puck, and how can I play through this pain if he really was in a lot of pain.
Yeah, it's a good point. Like the puck over the glass one, again, we're all on the same page. No excuse there. In fact, like I mentioned how much of a mistake I felt that it was. But Bridgette, to your last point, is he subconsciously taking preventative measures there? Like is he because of is he not taking the open ice that's given to him because he's not confident in his abilities to go end to end like he has when he's I don't know. I'm not really sure. But at the end of the day, it's certainly disappointing all the way around because I just get the sense that every calculated decision that the Bruins made down the stretch just was wrong. Like even to the point of let's play everybody the last couple of games to rev up for the playoffs. How'd that work out for you? They sucked in games 1 and 2, even though they split them. They weren't good in games 1 and 2. So it took them till games 3 and 4 down in Florida to wake up, and then it just feels like they mismanaged certain guys with their injuries down the stretch and forced them into the lineup. And I know hindsight's 2020, and if you look back in time, you'll see that they did give Krejci a couple games off here, and they did give Bergeron a few games off at the end. But if guys are dealing with stuff that's going to keep them out of playoff games, and you know this, like maybe keep them out a little bit longer than just a couple games in the end of the end of April, or the end of March or early April. So it's really frustrating for me. It just feels like when you have such a cushion, you have like just every opportunity in the world to go into that playoffs as rested and as prepared as possible. And they just overthought it every step of the way. And there's no excuse for that. Now, my question for you guys, my final question regarding Lindholm is,
well, just on that point, before you get to your final question, like I would just offer a reminder that like they can't sit everyone. There is a salary cap, and you can only call up a certain number of guys. So, like, yeah, you could sit 2 to 3 guys a game, but they did that for a stretch. Like for 2 weeks, there was a rotation of guys sitting, almost every game, and Lindholm did get a couple of those. I certainly think, had they known like he was in pain, or maybe he wasn't open enough with, like, who knows? We don't know enough, but I think it's fair to look at it now and be like, okay, why didn't Lindholm rest more? I mean, I think he played the last like 5 or 6 games consecutively, so like that's fair, but it's not like they're going to be able to rest everyone like the final week of the season.
Yeah, but think about, so Hall was coming back from an injury, and he got into the lineup towards the end of the regular season, which made sense for him. But at that point in time, why wouldn't you be trying to get a little bit of rest for Lindholm in that span? And if you think about it, Hall came back from that injury, and he looked pretty refreshed, and he looked fresh, and he was one of their better guys in the first few games of the playoffs in terms of production. And you could see that him taking the time he needed to heal helped him a lot. And you wonder what that kind of rest could have done for Lindholm in the playoffs. And I also think if you really go back to the last week of the season plus the playoffs, just think about how many guys were not 100%, either coming in off of injury or injured. Forbert was injured, and we didn't know whether or not he should come in. Foligno was coming off an injury. Hall had come off a little bit earlier. Then there's the Allmark injury that we still don't have a lot of clarity on. And it Bergeron and Krejci. There was a lot of injuries that the Bruins were dealing with that we didn't necessarily know. We could tell something was off about most of those guys, but they seemed to go through most of the season pretty healthy. Even after the surgeries, there were no complications to coming back from all those surgeries that guys had in the off season. And then all of a sudden it all falls apart in the playoffs and at the end of the regular season. So clearly, I mean, some of it's bad luck, but some of it is also definitely mishandling the rest and recovery.
But I mean, other teams didn't have the luxury of being able to rest guys down the stretch, and they're still
but they
playing,
did.
So
they did though.
No, the Florida Panthers didn't rest anyone. They're still going. Carolina didn't rest guys.
But
they're
if
still
you can
playing.
do it, why
Dallas,
would
Vegas,
No, but she's saying the Bruins could have though.
They could have. They have that.
Still could have lost in the first round.
Yeah, sure they could have, but
we've seen other teams that have rested guys and then they go in rusty. That's what they were trying to avoid. It didn't work for them, but that was the idea behind it. Was they didn't want to be like Tampa in 19 and go in rusty.
Okay, well, they instead went in injured, and that was clearly not a great strategy either. So I understand why they did it.
That wasn't the plan. I understand that.
Well, that's what happened.
Yeah, I mean, Patrice Bergeron got injured. It's easy to say now he shouldn't have played the last game, but
yeah, even if we're talking about Lindholm, though, that was just a rest situation, not, it wouldn't be that hard to have gotten him a game here and there. But I mean, maybe that's all not even relevant, because if he really didn't have any reason to think he needed to rest, I don't know what those conversations were like, because he was probably part of that decision making. Should he play? Should he not play? He probably said he was good, and they just put him in.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a desire to sit every single guy once you've crossed the finish line going into the playoffs. That I was more so talking about a couple of key guys with key injuries that you should know about. And you're right, if Lindholm wasn't being very transparent or very honest with himself and the team, then a team can only go off of so much. Now you would imagine that the medical staff is top notch and they don't need Lindholm's honesty. They should be able to figure out themselves. But if it's a pain threshold thing and they couldn't, and something wasn't appearing on an x-ray and they're relying on him and he's just saying, yeah, no, it's fine. Well, that's on him, and shame on him for doing that. Cause you need to have a better long-term and big picture mentality. If you're a top defenseman on your team and you're going into a playoffs with a broken foot. So Lindholm, that situation aside, that's one that annoys me with the rest. Everybody involved should have been better with that, including the player. But yeah, it does feel like the Bruins. Not everybody goes through injuries throughout the course of the regular season, and Jake DeBrusk was out of the lineup for a while from New Year's on, but for the most part, everybody was pretty healthy, and then, as you guys mentioned, in about mid-late February, yes, they had some injuries, some longer term injuries that kind of coincided with the impending trade deadline. And that's where things got challenging for the Bruins, because yes, you had guys out of the lineup, but then you had new guys entering the lineup, and then you started to get everybody back before the playoffs, and there was definitely a juggling issue with what are the best combinations, and it was kind of the perfect storm. But at the end of the day, you can't sit there and say, oh, well, our roster was too good on paper. We could have decided what we wanted to do. That's an excuse. And you certainly can't use injuries as an excuse, because everybody goes through that. So the only thing I'm just mentioning is if one of your top defensemen has a broken foot, you got to figure that out somewhere, whether it's through the player or the medical staff, or I don't know, maybe some stranger on the street watching him limp and saying, hey, call in front office. I think Lindholm might have a broken foot. Somehow you got to figure that out and get that guy some rest, because he was not himself in the playoffs. And was it the difference in the series? I mean, yeah, it could have been. It could have been. Hampus Lindholm was not Hampus Lindholm. And that's kind of the question I wanted to ask you guys based on last year and this year. And I know last year he got concussed, came back. I know this year he apparently had a broken foot or a fractured foot. But he just isn't the same person in the playoffs that he is in the regular season. And I know he had a couple of deep runs with Anaheim back in like 14, 15, and they went to the conference finals at least once with him on that blue line. But do you guys are you a little skeptical if his game transitions well to postseason hockey? It should. I'm not saying his game shouldn't. I'm just asking, is it fair to wonder?
Yeah, I mean, it's fair to wonder just because we haven't seen it in Boston yet. You know, we've talked about how he has 0 points in 11 playoff games with the Bruins, but you know, I do think like the injuries have to be taken into account. Getting concussed, missing time last year, dealing with this foot injury now this year, like again, doesn't totally excuse it, but like it's a factor, and I think it comes back to something we've talked about before, which is like defensemen tend to get injured more often than forwards, you know, especially around playoff time. Now, obviously, Lindholm's injury this year came before the playoffs, but it's, you know, it's why like when people talk about like, oh, well, Grzelcyk's not made for the playoffs. And it's like, yeah, okay, he's gotten injured a couple times as well. But it's like, you look at Lindholm, you look at the way he plays and his body, just everything, his size, you're like, he should be made for the playoffs, and yet you've still had to deal with injuries now in the playoffs the last 2 years. So it's hard. It's hard to stay healthy as a defenseman, and it's why, you know, so much of like whatever team wins the cup, it's often the one who just wins the war of attrition, who kind of just happens to luck out and not suffer injuries, especially on the back end. You know, I still really like Hampus Lindholm, and I would still feel good about having him in my lineup playing a lot of minutes heading towards the playoffs next year. Because I look at these and I'm like, I don't know that like they're injuries that were caused by, oh, he's just not built for the playoffs. Like last year, it's kind of a bad he maybe should have been more aware of Svechnikov closing in, but it's kind of a bad pass by Carlo behind the net that sort of sets him up in a bad spot. This year, what initiates the foot injury is just blocking a shot, and it's like, yeah, sorry, like defensemen have to do that. You know, Derek Forbort suffered 2 injuries blocking shots this year. It's like there's only so much you can do. You can't just like tell your defenseman to go the whole season without blocking shots. Like congrats, you're giving up 6 goals a game. You know, enjoy trying to make the playoffs doing that. Like, so I don't really know like what you Lindholm can do about it, but yeah, you know, until you see it, I think it becomes a question. And you know, now next year you're gonna be going on year 3, and like he's locked up for 7 more years. You know, after this one, so it's like, yeah, you want to see it. Like you want to see Hampus Lindholm play like a Norris Trophy candidate in the playoffs because you've seen in the regular season. But I'm not doing anything differently. Like I'm not gonna be like, oh well, they got to trade Lindholm because he's struggled in the playoffs 2 years. Like now you have to, just like every other defenseman, you have to hope he's going to be healthy come this time next year. And you know, unfortunately, there's lots of opportunities for him to not be healthy, but you kind of just have to cross your fingers.
I think theoretically he should be the same in the postseason performance-wise as he was in the regular season. No reason to think that the pressure should be able to get to him the way that it kind of looked like it did this series. If you think about it, what his strengths are, obviously, like you said, Brian, is skating, but he also is just a smart hockey player. So some of the mistakes he was making were not characteristic of him through the regular season. So yeah, in theory, he shouldn't have any issue transitioning his game to the playoffs. Smart defenseman, quick defenseman can affect series. Look at Brandon Montour. So the injuries, turns out 2 playoffs in a row have slowed him down to the point where he was not 100% himself, and you could tell.
I would say, in addition to, like, when you say the team that often wins the cup is one who wins the war of attrition, I agree with that. But the team that wins the cup, they're all playing hurt too. So it's not about avoiding injury. It's about, you're going to be injured. I guarantee you, if the Panthers win the Stanley Cup this year, you'll probably find out that Brandon Montour is playing with a separated shoulder, or, a sprained something like a sprained wrist, or there's going to be something that comes out, and you're going to sit there and say, oh, wow, I can't believe he played that well playing through that injury. Like it's less about avoiding getting hurt and more about maintaining a higher floor for your standards when you are hurt. And I know that varies injury to injury. Obviously, it's going to affect different parts of your game depending on what your injury is. But I guarantee you guys, the Bruins are never going to win a Stanley Cup without some of their top players being hurt and doing so. It's just the reality of the sport. So it makes me question if I just don't want the Bruins to be one of those teams where it's like they're fragile to the point where if something's lingering or hurting them, that's it. They can't be relatively themselves. And I know that's like really unfair for me to say and kind of like inhumane for me to expect of people, but it's the sport that they play, and their opponents are faced with the same obstacles too. And like I said, the 4 teams remaining in Vegas, Carolina, Dallas, and Florida, there's stuff going on in those locker rooms, and they're still performing at a level to be where they are. And so, yeah, it is a little unfair to sit there and say tough shit, play through it. But if you want to win a Stanley Cup, tough shit, play through it, and or not play through it, but you got to play through it and be the impact player that, to an extent, that the team relied on you to be. And that's just the nature of a results driven business.
Yeah, like in some ways, it's almost like the nagging injuries are almost worse than the ones that like straight up force guys out of the lineup, because it's like then it eliminates any question where it's like, all right, Bergeron and Krejci are out, like that's it. They're not playing. They didn't even make the trip, and so here's the lineup. Like you guys got to step up. And then it's like when Bergeron comes back, there's the question of like, okay, well, how much can he handle? What percentage of himself is he? Like, same with Lindholm. Now that we know he was playing through this, and Ullmark, like saying, right, like if game 5 or 6 comes and Ullmark is so injured that he just can't play, it's like then you don't have goaltending questions. Then Jeremy Swayman just goes in and he has to step up. But because Ullmark is good enough to play and he hasn't been ruled out, it's like, okay, now you have to do all right, well, he can play, but at what percentage? And can he make all the movements he has to make? And, not trying to make excuses. Like you're right, Brian. If you're in the lineup, you got to play, like, period. Like any hockey player will tell you that. If you're in the lineup, you're expected to perform. No one's gonna feel sorry because you find out after, he was only 65%. Like, well, if you can't do the job well enough, then you shouldn't be in. So, yeah, like it's absolutely fair. But it is tough. Like when you get those nagging ones where guys are clearly less than 100% and you're still trying to figure out if they can handle, the minutes that they usually handle and all that. So, yep, every team deals with it. It doesn't. Ultimately, the Bruins are still up 3-1 and blew the lead, and guys being banged up doesn't excuse that. Like that's still a series they should have won. Period. At the end of the day. So, but yeah, on Lindholm in particular, like it does help explain some of his play. And yes, you wish they'd caught it earlier and knew exactly what they were dealing with, because they probably could have taken a better, smarter approach.
Can this Swedish reporter also find out what happened to Ullmark? Can we get him on the case?
Yeah.
Him or her on the case to cracking the injury, like an injury that we know exists. We just don't know what it is quite yet and how bad it. But and the thing about the nagging injuries too is when it's that, or when it's more defined, you take the decision out of the player's hand to decide whether or not he's good enough to go. And a lot of these guys were saying they were good and they weren't. So that whole decision-making process looks a lot differently if the hairline fracture shows up on the x-ray or if whatever was bothering Ullmark had more of a definitive display that you could go, okay, well, this needs to look better than it does right now for you to go in, or what have you. I think that the Bruins allowed their players to make those decisions on their, not necessarily 100% on their own, but to weigh in heavily in those decisions, and they didn't work out.
No, they allowed the inmates to run the asylum, and you can't have that. Like, the players have to play, coaches coach, medical staff. You have to be able to make tough decisions when it just might be best for the team. Now, obviously, the biggest one would be Bergeron coming back into the series after Game 4. Like, that was the biggest personnel decision, where it was like the coach listening to the player. And I don't think there's a person in Boston in the moment, fan, coach, player, ownership, management, or otherwise, that would have said, Bergie, you're good to play. Sorry, we'll rest up. The theory made sense in theory, but I think Montgomery was not alone in being like, okay, Bergie, come here, get back in the lineup. Like, I think that one makes sense, but just in general, yeah, the best games they played were games 3 and 4, bar none, and the lineup was, I mean, you were down your quote unquote top 2 centers. Like, everybody had to step up and fill in, and then those are perfect examples of, yeah, I mean, like, you don't have your ideal lineup out there, but you can still find ways to win and play the right way. And so maybe lessons learned there too. I don't know. It's I don't know if the Bruins are going to have that issue next year where they're going to have an all-star type roster going into a playoffs.
Or maybe not even the two same goalies.
Well, at least one of them, yeah.
Or a 40-point cushion where they can afford to rest guys. Like,
no. So, yeah, lessons learned all the way around. I mean, so the Lindholm, in typical skate pod fashion, we decided to we didn't even we honestly waited it was midweek. It's not like we it's not like it broke on Monday or something like that. We recorded Sunday. Like, we waited till halfway through the week and banged out a couple episodes. But of course, the second we finished up, then the Lindholm news kind of broke. So we had to come back on and cover that. And as we mentioned, it explains a few things, but it excuses absolutely nothing on our end here. Was there any other final thoughts you guys had on this story? If not, we can probably just move on to the rest of the episode.
No, we already ran much longer than I was anticipating. So
yeah, that's true. Well, you know us, we can't stop talking once we get going. So, all right, yeah. Well, let's just move on to the rest of the episode then. Hey guys, thanks for watching the Skate Podcast. If you want to see more of our videos, visit our playlist.
Not in front of a screen? You can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Don't forget to follow us on social media. And if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment.